Efforts to attain an overall reduction in carbon use by convincing people to focus on their personal use of fossil fuels cannot achieve that goal. Even if most people change their behavior, changes in personal use of fossil fuels cannot produce the needed reductions in carbon use. Only government policies can produce changes on the required scale. So this is basically saying that just convincing people to reduce carbon use is not going to happen. People just aren't going to do it. The only way to reduce carbon, and even if we do convince them, it still won't be enough. And the only way to do it is have the government enforce it. That's what it's saying.
Excellent. So our conclusion is, hey, efforts to obtain an overall reduction by convincing people to focus on their personal use cannot achieve our goal, because even if most people change their behavior, it wouldn't be enough. So we need government policies. Only government policies can actually change it to the amount that would actually impact how much is happening. Cool. All right. So what is necessary or needed for this conclusion that these efforts, by just having people do their own personal levels, cannot achieve this goal? So go ahead and start with A.
Convincing most people to focus on their personal use of fossil fuels would not lead to their successfully pressuring the government into implementing policies that reduce carbon use. I mean, maybe.
Lead to their successfully pressuring the government. Okay, let's leave that one for a minute.
The calculations needed to determine how best to minimize one's personal use of fossil fuels are too difficult for individuals to carry out on their own. Like, that has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's too difficult or not. It might not be too difficult, and we still can't do it on a personal level.
And it says nothing about calculating either.
Exactly.
Efforts to convince people to focus on reducing their personal use of fossil fuels have been made only by those who are not currently involved in framing government policies. Their personal use of, I think this is the one I chose.
So what may, okay, so this one is, do the current efforts being made to convince people to change their ways have to be made only by those who are not involved in framing government policy?
I mean, this is what happens when like my science stuff kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, I'm thinking, if people are part of the government policy making, that would be biased. So they can't be the same part of the group that's trying to convince people, because then there would be a conflict of interest. So that's why I chose that question.
Okay, but so if I am for, like, if I'm a scientist and I'm trying to eliminate overall reduction of carbon use, I can't be out there trying to convince people to not use things that have fossil fuels.
Oh, darn it.
Like, can't Midas morals be against people using fossil fuels? And just because government, like, and it's saying only government policies can produce change, like, people involved in government policies don't have to necessarily be scientists. Most of them are actually just politicians, right?
I know, but the way I was reading this is the same people that are trying to convince people to reduce it cannot be the same people that are making the policies.
Yeah, and does that have to be true?
In my mind, it has to be true.
Do you see why that was a misread, though? Like, think about AOC. Like, so AOC can't be involved in trying to get government policy changes and convincing the public at the same time to not use fossil fuels.
I mean, they could, but I would ask, what's their ulterior motive? You know?
Yeah, and that's fine that you asked their ulterior motive, but that doesn't destroy our conclusion.
Oh,
Do you see that? It's too, do you see how it's too strong?
yeah.
Excellent. All right, what about D?
It is easier to convince the government to change its policies on carbon use than to convince people to reduce their personal use of fossil fuels. I think I chose this one first and then C the second time.
So why is D wrong?
Because we don't know if it's easier to convince them.
Right. Maybe it's way easier to actually to convince people to reduce their personal use, but it's not enough change. Like, it's easy to convince, like, it's not enough to make an impact. Who knows? It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be easier. All right, what about E?
People who are concerned about environmental issues are more likely to support political candidates who support environment. We don't.
I bet a lot of people pick this because it's probably true in life, but it's not necessary for a conclusion to be true.
Yeah, like that doesn't even, in my mind, I was like, I don't, that doesn't, who cares?
Who cares? Who cares? Excellent. And that's why our answer is A.